My name is Allison Grant. I'm 34, and I help businesses recover when numbers stop making sense. That Friday afternoon, I was finishing a client meeting in Minneapolis when Calvin Price called from my retreat in Wisconsin. His first question made me sit up straight. "Allison, did you approve a name for the property?" I told him no. Seconds later, 3 photos hit my phone. The wooden sign at the entrance had been covered by one. Catering tables were going up near the lake, and a photographer stood beside champagne glasses. Then I saw Derek, my husband, standing in the middle of it all. A woman I had never met was beside him, close enough that I did not need an explanation. Calvin sent one more picture. It was a brochure introducing Derek and Brooke Stanton as the people reimagining the property for its next chapter. I stared at that sentence until it stopped feeling real. The retreat belonged to me, and no one had asked me to reimagine anything. I called Derek before I could convince myself to wait. He answered like nothing was wrong and said he was at a corporate planning weekend. I asked why his corporate planning weekend was happening on my property. He went quiet, then said he was going to explain after the weekend. "Explain what?" I asked, and he said he was creating an opportunity for us. I looked at Brooke beside him and asked who exactly he meant by us. He did not answer. Instead, he said I was making this more complicated than it needed to be. That landed harder than I expected because he sounded irritated, not ashamed. I ended the call and phoned Calvin again. I told him not to shut down the event yet. I needed to know what Derek had promised everyone there. If he was confident enough to launch a future on property that was not his, then this had started long before that afternoon. I did not need to chase him across state lines. I needed to let him keep talking. For the first time, I wanted to hear the whole lie. For almost 10 years, Derek and I had built the kind of marriage that looked steady from the outside. During the last year, though, he became harder to reach. Always networking, meeting partners, or staying late for expansion meetings. I kept telling myself his career demanded more of him. When he said I had emotionally checked out, I wondered if he was right. My work took a lot out of me. I spent my days helping family businesses survive problems their owners had ignored. So by evening, I often wanted quiet. Derek made that quiet sound like proof I had stopped caring. I believed him often enough to spend months examining myself instead of looking closely at him. The retreat was different. My aunt, who raised me, left me the property after she died. It was 3 aging cabins beside a Wisconsin lake. Not a polished resort waiting to make money. The roofs leaked. The plumbing needed work. And the paths had been neglected. I paid for the repairs myself and spent weekends bringing the place back to life. Derek never shared my attachment to it. He called the retreat my expensive hobby and said I was too sentimental whenever I refused to sell it. He rarely helped with the work, and I never asked him to pretend the place mattered. Now that same expensive hobby was printed across brochures as the foundation of his next opportunity. Somehow, it became valuable the moment he imagined a future without me in it. Calvin kept sending pictures. Patricia was there, smiling as she walked Brooke from one cabin to another, while Walter followed steps behind them looking uncomfortable. Brooke was not behaving like a guest. She checked tables, spoke with vendors, adjusted the signage, and moved through the event like someone who had been planning it for weeks. That was when my anger became something colder. Derek had not simply brought another woman onto my property. Brooke had helped build whatever was happening there, and his parents stood beside them as if it were normal. I still did not know how much each person knew, but I intended to find out. Calvin got a full copy of the brochure to me. Brooke was not listed as a guest Derek had invited. Her name appeared with the event contacts. She had coordinated the photographer, catering, signs, promotional materials, and launch setup. According to the brochure, the retreat was preparing for a new ownership chapter. Derek had told Brooke that I agreed to transfer the property to him. There was no contract because there had never been an agreement. He had simply told everyone the paperwork was coming and my approval was settled. What bothered me was how much Brooke accepted without hearing a word from me. She knew Derek was married. Even if he convinced her our marriage was over. She had never met me, received an email from me, or seen authorization with my name on it. Still, she used her contacts to help launch a future built on my property without ever asking me first. I did not know how much Derek had lied to her, but I could not ignore that Brooke chose not to verify something that worked in her favor. I called Rebecca Dalton, a family attorney I knew. I explained the retreat, the event, and what Derek had been telling people. Rebecca told me not to rush into a confrontation. First, I needed to protect the property from commitments Derek might make. I called Calvin and said the event could continue because the vendors had done nothing wrong. But no bookings, permanent signs, agreements, or property commitments could be approved without my signature. It was a small boundary, but it changed what Derek could promise from that moment forward. I was not calling police or ordering everyone. I was simply refusing to let Derek promise away something he did not own. Then Calvin called and said Derek was preparing to address the guests. Several people were asking when the transfer would be completed. I told Calvin to keep his phone nearby and put me on speaker only if someone asked who approved it. I had no intention of ruining Derek's launch. I wanted to hear what he would say when someone finally asked the right question. Derek began speaking near the main cabin, while Calvin kept me connected through his phone. He talked about the retreat entering a new chapter, with wellness weekends, private events, and partnership opportunities. He thanked his parents and introduced Brooke as the person who would shape the guest experience. I sat in Minneapolis and listened as people applauded a future I had never approved. Then one prospective partner asked when the ownership transfer would be completed. Derek answered without hesitation and said the owner had agreed, with only technical details left to finish. Calvin stepped forward and said the owner had not approved any transfer. The applause stopped, and for the first time that afternoon, Derek sounded unsure. He tried to laugh it off and told everyone I was handling paperwork, so there was nothing to worry about. Calvin stayed calm and said, "Allison told me 20 minutes ago that this property is not being transferred." I heard Brooke ask what Calvin meant, and Patricia demanded an explanation. Seconds later, my phone rang, and Derek's first words were not an apology. He asked why I was embarrassing him in front of everyone. I told him I was not even there, and he snapped that I knew what he meant. I kept my voice level and said, "Then tell them what I agreed to." Derek started talking about timing, plans, and conversations we still needed to finish. So I stopped him. I said, "Tell Brooke when I agreed to give you the retreat, and tell your parents when I agreed to sell it." Nothing came back. The silence lasted long enough for me to hear someone set down a glass. Then Brooke said Derek had told her I had already signed off. Derek answered that I basically had, and that was when I finally spoke directly to her. "No," I said. "I did not." Nobody argued after that because there was nothing left to explain away. The launch had not officially ended, but the celebration was gone. Everyone there had arrived believing a different version of the same future, and now they were finally comparing what Derek had told them that evening. Brooke called me. I expected an apology or an excuse, but instead she asked when Derek and I had decided to separate. I told her we had not. The silence on her end told me Derek had given her a different version of our marriage. Brooke said Derek told her we had been separated for months and were only sharing a house while sorting out our finances. He told her the retreat would become his after the settlement. I asked if she knew he was still married to me. She admitted she did, but said she believed our marriage was over. I did not let that erase her responsibility. I said, "You knew he still had a wife." Brooke answered, "Yes, but I believed it was over." I told her, "That is not the same as not knowing," and she did not argue. Brooke said she wanted to believe Derek because the future he described was what she wanted. He promised a stable relationship, a new business, and a place they could build together. I asked if he told her I had given him the retreat. When she said yes, I asked why she never thought to confirm that with me. She stayed quiet before answering. Then she said, "Because I wanted what he said to be true." It did not make her innocent, but it was honest. She knew there were questions she should have asked, and she had chosen not to ask them. Brooke told me Derek claimed I barely used the retreat and that he had paid for most renovations. He also told her I depended on his income and that his family understood our separation. Then she repeated something Patricia had told her. "Once Allison finally lets go, everything will be easier." That told me Patricia had accepted Derek's version without asking me whether it was true. Brooke said she had messages about the retreat and would send them. I told her to send anything involving the property. What she did with everything else was her responsibility. After we hung up, a message from Derek appeared. He said I was destroying his future over a place I barely used. I read it before setting my phone down. He still thought the retreat was the problem. Following Rebecca's advice, I went through our finances carefully. I started with joint expenses, including hotels, weekend trips, dinners, and charges Derek called networking costs. I had accepted those explanations because I trusted my husband. Now, several expenses lined up with Brooke, and the innocent explanations no longer made sense. The money hurt, but the larger betrayal was the story Derek built around it. He told his parents he paid for most retreat renovations and told Brooke I depended on his income. Neither claim was true. I paid almost every renovation expense myself, and my consulting work brought in more than Derek earned. I had carried household expenses when Derek changed jobs, and I never used that against him. I thought that was what marriage meant when one person needed support. Derek had taken the stability I created and presented it as proof of his success. When Walter called, I could tell he was questioning his son's story. He asked whether Derek had really financed the retreat, and I answered simply, "No," I said. "Almost all of it came from me." Walter went quiet before saying, "Then I've been thanking the wrong person for years." I heard the embarrassment in his voice, but I did not soften the truth. Brooke was beginning to face consequences too. One vendor she worked with asked why they had been brought onto private property without direct authorization from the owner. Nobody fired Brooke or publicly attacked her. The vendor told her that future private property bookings she referred would require direct owner approval. Her credibility had clearly taken a hit because she chose not to verify what Derek told her. Derek's problems followed him to work after he used business contacts to approach prospective partners for his private venture. His employer began asking how those contacts had been used. None of that came from me, and I never contacted his company. Derek had built a future from other people's trust, while Brooke helped because she wanted his promises to be true. I understood that I did not have to punish either of them to protect myself. I did not need another confrontation or another attempt to make them understand. I only had to stop standing between them and the consequences of their choices. Derek came back to Minneapolis and asked to see me in person. I agreed because there was nothing left to investigate and nothing left for him to explain away. When he sat across from me, he looked exhausted. Still, the first thing he talked about was everything he had lost. He told me the launch was ruined. Brooke had ended their relationship, and his parents barely trusted anything he said anymore. The prospective partners had backed away, and his employer was questioning how he used company contacts for his private venture. Derek rubbed his hands together and said, "Everything is falling apart." I listened until he finally stopped talking. Then I asked him one question. "Which one of those things did I make you lie about?" Derek looked at me without answering. For the first time, he seemed to understand that listing his consequences was not the same as taking responsibility for creating them. I told him the affair was a betrayal, but it was not the only reason our marriage was over. He had treated my money, my work, my silence, and my property as resources he could use whenever they served his plans. He had promised Brooke a future built partly on something that belonged to me. Worse, he expected me to cooperate once he had already announced it. Derek said he could fix everything if I gave him enough time. I told him I hoped he did fix himself, but I did not have to remain his wife while he learned how. I told him I wanted a divorce. He lowered his head, and this time, he did not argue. Walter called me afterward and apologized for staying silent when things had stopped making sense. He admitted that keeping peace had become an excuse for avoiding difficult questions. Patricia reacted differently and insisted I could have handled everything privately. I did not try to convince her that my boundary was reasonable. Brooke sent every message she had involving the retreat and told me she had ended things with Derek. She said she would deal with the damage the launch had done to her professional credibility herself. I replied once, "You were lied to, but you also chose not to ask. Do not make that choice again." We never became friends, and I never needed us to. Derek had lost the future he invented, and Brooke had lost the future she chose to believe. I was finished carrying responsibility for either one. Months after the divorce, I returned to the retreat alone. Calvin had restored the sign, and the cabins looked like themselves again. There was no celebration waiting for me. I stood beside the lake, relieved that the place was still mine, without needing that fact to hurt anyone else. Calvin asked if I was ready to sell. I told him no, but I wanted the retreat to mean more than memory. I decided to reserve several weekends each year for people caring for aging parents, sick partners, or dependent relatives. I wanted caregivers to have somewhere they could rest without guilt. Brooke never contacted me again, and I was comfortable with that. She had lost Derek, the future he promised her, and professional trust after helping organize the launch without verifying my approval. Patricia eventually sent an apology, but I did not need another conversation. Walter had shown me that accountability did not require forgiveness. Derek sent an apology through his attorney after everything was settled. He did not ask me to reconsider the divorce or give him another chance. I read it once, then put it away without answering. Some chapters do not need one final conversation to prove they are finished. For years, I thought keeping the peace was maturity. I believed giving more, asking fewer questions, and swallowing disappointment could protect a marriage. I finally understood that boundaries are not punishments for other people. They are how we stop abandoning ourselves to keep someone else comfortable. Derek lost our marriage because of his choices, and Brooke lost her imagined future because she ignored questions she did not want answered. Patricia faced what blind loyalty had protected, while Walter faced what his silence allowed. I did not win because any of them suffered. I won because I stopped carrying responsibility for choices that were never mine. If you have ever set a boundary with someone you still cared about, share your experience in the comments. Like and share this story if someone you know needs the reminder. Subscribe for more stories about relationships, consequences, and finding yourself again. Sometimes protecting your peace is where living honestly begins.